Hey everyone, it's Zach Bruner here from FlurrySports, and it is fantasy football season. We've made it past July 4th, and now fantasy football research is really starting to begin. Now we're back here. Again, you probably watched the video last year, used the tool last year. We have refreshed our boom, bust, and consistency rankings from last season's data for fantasy football. If you go to FlurrySports.org or the link below, you can go to the table that I will be showing you and talking about through this entire video. Our data for this tool is the best on the market. I've seen some other companies now refresh their boom bust rankings to kind of match ours a little bit from last year, which makes sense because we just did it better. However, ours is still the best on the market because the way that we frame the data that we use, everything is relevant, everything makes sense. And I'll go through it here on this video. You can use it for your redraft leagues. You can use it for best ball. More on best ball later. You can use it for DFS. You can use it for anything. But we will go into what is a boom, bust, or starter every given week for fantasy football in our tool. Let's go into it right now. Okay, here we are. The fantasy football consistency and boom, bust rankings from last year. Using it for this year. Again, link in the bio for this table. This was last year's video. The new one will be right there. But let's go into what is this data, right? How do we define it? So because there's different amount of players, you're usually starting one quarterback, two running backs, three wide receivers. Each team is starting one quarterback, maybe using 2 to 3 running backs. So like in terms of position depth, we have to define what a boom, a bust, and a start worthy performance differently. We just have to. So just to get into this simply, a quarterback, tight end, and DST, if they finish top 3 at their position any given week, that's considered a boom performance. They were one of the top performers. They probably helped you win that week. On the flip side, if they were outside the top 18, then that's considered a bust. They probably lost you that week, right? And just to be considered a starter, a start-worthy play for quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses, we're going to call that a top 12. 10-team, 12-team is basically the standard size leagues for fantasy football right now. So as long as you had one of the top 12 players at the position, then you were probably sitting pretty good. They weren't the reason why you lost, right? Running back, we're expanding that a little bit further. Running back, you got to be top 6 at the position to be a boom, outside the top 36 to be a bust, and then a start-worthy play is top 24. Wide receiver, similar, but we're expanding it even further because there's more wide receivers to be considered here. Boom is still top 6. However, outside the top 48 is a bust. And to be a starter, you have to be in the top 30. Okay? So for example, let's just, for the sake of simplicity, let's call it a 2-week season. A wide receiver finished 5th in week 1 and 25th in week 2. That means for a boom percentage, it was 50. For a starter percentage, it was 100. And then a bust percentage of 0, right? Now, why is this data useful? I'll get into how we can use it for a best ball league, but in the simplest form, how useful is looking at end of season data, right? How useful is it to say, oh, this player, the wide receiver 5 was better than wide receiver 7 because they had more stats. They had more fantasy points at the end of the year. That's not really true, right? That's not true. Let's call it the Desean Jackson rule. If Desean Jackson went for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns week 1, and then week 2, he had a 2-catch, 13-yard performance. Well, I mean, through 2 weeks, he has 213 yards. It's very good. However, he probably won you week 1, and he was probably the reason you lost week 2. Would you rather have that, or would you rather have a player who went for 80 yards and a touchdown each week? The second player I'm talking about had less fantasy points, but they were good both weeks, right? They weren't the reason why you lost either week, and they may have been the reason why you won. That is why this data is useful. It just gives more context to the end of the season stats. Now, this is ordered as the top players from last year. If you want to break it down, make it a little bit more simple to see, go to position here, and let's talk about quarterbacks. So now we got all the quarterbacks here. We got the top 40 ranked, so there's plenty to go off of here. Josh Allen was the number one quarterback in fantasy last year for good reason. He was a boom, a top 3 play 44% of the time. He was a bust a quarter of the time. So, I mean, there's no argument. He was the best quarterback last year. The stats here even prove that as well. And by the way, our quarterback stats are better than anybody else on the market because we don't use every single game. We pretty much do, but let's say in the sake of Taylor Heineke, if Taylor Heineke, I believe, went out hurt one game pretty early, or maybe he didn't start right away, something like that happened. We're not going to count that game because quarterbacks typically are going to play the entire game. They're more predictable. We can assume your quarterback, if you drafted a quarterback, you can assume they're going to play the entire game. So if they leave hurt after a half, that shouldn't count against them, right? That shouldn't count against them. Running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, on the other hand, if they leave hurt, that's part of the position. That's part of the thing. It could be a game plan thing that they're taking out, right? Another example is Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill. I have it that he played 4 games because he started 4 games at quarterback. I'm not going to use his non-quarterback games against him. It sounds like he's probably not going to play quarterback this year, so it's not as important, I would say. But when he was a quarterback last year, he was a boom a quarter of the time. Half the time he was start worthy, and a quarter of the time he was not, right? So that's like if we used all of his games, right, then he would end a bust almost all the time. And that's just not the reality. We also don't use any data from week 18. If you are in a fantasy league that plays in week 18, I would reevaluate. But anyways, let's get into this a little bit further. You can look at this data and derive a little bit more information from it. Let's look at Derek Carr and Ryan Tannehill, for example. They were quarterback 12 and 13 last year. By all accounts, that's really good. You were a top 12 guy. That should be considered very good. However, Derek Carr's stats here and Ryan Tannehill's stats here suck. They're terrible. They were never top 3. They were start worthy less than half of the time, and they were a bust or the reason you lost over half of the time. So obviously you would rather have Lamar Jackson, whatever. Russell Wilson, even considering the 3 games Russell Wilson missed, if this is a redraft league, you know he's not going to play those games, which helps. I would much rather have Russell Wilson than both those guys. I would have probably not Big Ben. Not Big Ben. Like you understand. Like I would probably rather have Taylor Heineke than those guys. Sure, he also wasn't a boom, but he lost us less games. That's the reality. Jimmy Garoppolo, he lost us less games. He was a bust a third of the time. And sure, he's a 0. He didn't win us any games. Neither did Derek Carr or Ryan Tannehill. So again, when you're saying at the end of the year, quarterback 12 and 13 were better than quarterback 18, that's not exactly true. And these stats give you more context for it, right? We got quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, wide receivers, defense. Let's look at defense really quick. Defense, obviously, a little bit more volatile. Cowboys were definitely the best defense last year, thanks to the sacks and interceptions, a lot of defensive touchdowns. They were a bust only 18% of the time. Start worthy 3/4 of the time. That's really good. But looking at some of these other ones, New England was DST 2. They were a bust a third of the time, and they were a boom 19% of the time. The Dolphins at number 4, they were a boom a quarter of the time and a bust only a quarter of the time. If you told me at the end of last season that you would have rather had Miami over New England, Like, I probably would have disagreed. Most people would disagree. They would go look at the stats and be like, oh, see, you're stupid. New England had 12 more points. They're just a better team. But in reality, if you look at this stuff, like, there's no argument. Like, I would much rather have Miami. They won us more games. They lost us fewer games. And they were start worthy, essentially the same. I would much rather have Miami. Green Bay. Green Bay was like the picture of consistency, right? They were a boom 0% of the time. They never were a top 3 unit. Despite, a few weeks, Rasul Douglas had, a nice couple pick sixes there. Shout out to the banner behind me. They still didn't finish top 3. But in terms of bust, and you can click on these to order it this way as well. In terms of bust, they busted the same amount of times as the number 1 defense. They never really lost you games. And because the defensive position is so volatile, as long as your defense doesn't lose you games, then you probably won that position. So number 8 defense last year, Packers, they're more valuable than top 8 or than number 8. They were probably a top 5 unit for you in terms of overall encompassing value. That is what this does. That is what these stats are for. In terms of boom bust, best ball. Obviously, best ball leagues, they only count the points of the top scoring people on your team. So because of that, you can take more risk and you care about the boom performances much more than you hate the bust performances. Because even if your player busts, you have other people on your team who could pick up the slack and be your scorer for that week, right? So then if you want to look at, who was a boom the most of the time or whatever, Christian McCaffrey was the top 4 running backs. That's not a surprise in the slightest. When he's on the field, he's fantastic. So maybe you take a risk with Christian McCaffrey, who is electric every time he's on the field, and then you balance it out with somebody who is extremely consistent and won't be a bust, like Austin Eckler. Never was a bust last year, was a starter 80% of the time. So you're balancing that out with your roster construction for your best ball league. You're looking for these people who can peak, and when they don't peak, then hopefully you have that steady floor guy who can pick up the slack that week. That's how I like to construct my rosters, along with stacking, stuff like that. We can go into that in a different video. But that's what this data is for. And it adds context, and you can use this data for your best ball leagues this year. You can check back on it and use it for DFS, who's most likely to go off, who is most likely to give us a ceiling play so we can win a GPP on DraftKings and take home a bunch of money, right? You're not looking for the players like Cordell Patterson last year, let's say, for example, relative to pricing. I understand Cordell Patterson was really cheap a lot of the time last year, and he finished as running back 7. But in terms of a tournament, I would much rather have DeAndre Swift, who was a boom a third of the time. Obviously, he missed games. That goes into his rank. I understand that. But I'm saying the players that don't give you that ceiling are less valuable for DFS. They're less valuable for best ball. And this is a table that shows you ceiling, floor, and everything in the middle. Okay? Now, we've been talking about best ball quite a bit here. And if you haven't got in on best ball and haven't done any best ball drafts for this year yet, and you want to use this data to make a bunch of money, I suggest going down to the link in the description below for Underdog Fantasy, or click this right here. It'll take you to Underdog using our link. It'll give you a deposit bonus. Use that extra money in your account to multiply and get a lot more money. You know how it goes, hundreds, thousands. And there's a lot available on Underdog here. Let me show you how much we got available. Okay, if you look at Underdog here, so we got the Puppy 2. It's a smaller tournament, $5 entry. Still $500,000 in prizes. We got Best Ball Mania 3, $25 entry, $10 million in prizes. There's ongoing best ball leagues being drafted on Underdog right now. So click the link in the description below, or scroll down below the tool on FlurrySports.org and click the Underdog link there. You'll get a deposit match if you use our link. use that extra money to make more money. You know how it goes. And using our stats, our table, your brain, and some of our other analysis from future videos and articles, you can make a lot of money this year on Underdog. Underdog is a fantastic site. I use it. I love it. And there's more than just football, but we're just talking football right now. So get over on Underdog today. You will not regret it. Now, that's what we got for that stat. The consistency, boom, bust, rankings. But let me know what else you want. That stat, that table, those stats, those are free. Anything else we do here is going to be free for you. So let me know what other stats you want for fantasy football this year, what articles and coverage you want on FlurrySports.org for fantasy. We got you. What videos you want here, we got you. If you want us to do other stats-based videos, if you want us to do specific shows during the season, if you want to make sure there's an ad drop show, a start-sit show, a DFS show, if you want DFS content, best ball content, dynasty content, all of the above. We got a really good team here on FlurrySports.org, so we will get that stuff for you. We're here for you. We're going to win leagues together this year. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see here and on FlurrySports.org, and I'll do that for you. Until then, see you later.